ecosystem in community safety. And that's part of the equity piece as well, is the recognition by other police services as to the role that they're playing and how they are operating interchangeably.
La politique fédérale mentionne que la règle est...
The federal policy said that the rules are pretty rigid. They pay 52% and the province pays 48%. So what happens when the province can't increase their funding? Does that have an effect on the equity?
So that's an absolute limiting factor for us. We are obliged to follow provincial jurisdiction in that regard. And so if the province is unable to match funding or chooses not to, we cannot act unilaterally in that respect.
Merci. Et voilà. Merci beaucoup. Suivant, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question will be directed to the two RCMP representatives. Have either of you ever heard of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Persons?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I have.
Mr. Chair, yes, I have.
Which calls to justice have you responded to? Mr. Larkin, starting.
Actually, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown as the national lead.
Sorry, Mr. Larkin. This is a national inquiry into the police, not just the Indigenous unit that you can silo this into and say it's Mr. Brown's problem. Mr. Larkin, it's important that if you don't know, to just say you don't know. Mr. Larkin, have you read the inquiry, the national inquiry?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, I have. And I apologize for turning it over to Assistant Commissioner Brown. This is a priority for the RCMP Commissioner, and obviously Assistant Commissioner Brown can provide specifics. I don't have that information at my fingertips or have full knowledge of that. However...
Do you even know how many recommendations there are to the RCMP?
I actually do not know the exact number, how many recommendations, but I can tell you that the Commissioner has created a Reform and Accountability Directorate to track all of the various recommendations, because there's been numerous reports, numerous recommendations to the RCMP.
Do you know how disappointing that is to hear, Mr. Larkin, for Indigenous people, particularly the families of murdered and missing Indigenous people, that you can't even name one of them? Can you name one of the recommendations?
Again, I will have Assistant Commissioner Brown.
No, Mr. Larkin, I'm talking to you. Question. Can you name one? If you don't know, you could say I don't know.
I do not have that.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So out of the 231 recommendations, it becomes very complex. Some are provided directly towards the RCMP. Some are provided to our stakeholders, and some are provided in combination between us and others.
Do you know how many directly pertain to the RCMP?
I can't provide an exact number, but I believe it would be around 30.
I believe you might be discussing the TRC or another report, but the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women has a specific chapter dedicated to the RCMP, has 10. Could you name one of them?
Yeah, I can name one of them.
Sure, so, please. Which one are you working on?
So Mr. Chair, just for your confidence, I'm not confused with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where there's 96 recommendations. And a springboard from that is a direct quote from Justice Murray Sinclair in 2015. We must turn 150 years of negativity into generations of positivity. On that, Mr. Speaker, we have provided a guide for missing and murdered women, for victims of homicide, as well as a guidebook for missing women. We're presently having that translated into a number of different languages, including several Indigenous languages across Canada. So that's just one.
Public safety
thank you.
said...
Mr. Desjardins, that is the time. We will come back to you, certainly. Turning to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to begin my questions to Public Safety Canada, and if I have time, I may have a couple for the Auditor General and for the RCMP. Mr. Tupper, in the Auditor General's report, there were some fairly critical comments directed towards public safety Canada, specifically around documentation and justifying where things were spent. One of the quotes from Section 3.22 was this: the department did not know how much of the additional program funding it had allocated to the specific self-administered police service agreements and community tripartite agreements, and it did not know what amount of funding remained to be allocated. That's a pretty critical comment that Public Safety Canada couldn't figure out where the money went. I mean, it was justified here. He didn't have a modernized information technology system, but an Excel spreadsheet could have probably done the same thing. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but I mean it's fairly concerning. And it goes on in Section 3.24, talking about the review. It says, according to Public Safety Canada, the department last performed a review in 2018-2019, 6 years ago. Continue on, of RCMP expenditures to ensure that funds were used for the program. However, the department could not provide documentation of this review. So I want to comment from you on those two elements to begin with. First, financial management and accountability. Where did these funds actually go? Can you give us any update on how public safety is tracking funds? And second, have you found that review from 2018-19? Is there any documentation within the department of the 2018-19 review?
With respect to your first question, so I concede our data system was inadequate, is inadequate in terms of our ability to produce accurate and reports. Those are things that we have already started to undertake and document our ability to track that money in a clearer way. And those are things that we will be able to invest in and start to build up. I'm not going to make any excuse, having said earlier, I was in a different capacity, but in the department when the first review was done, and I remember thinking, how is it possible that we've gone since 1996 without updating the policy? And now I'm shaking my head and saying, how is it possible we went another 10 years and still haven't done it? That is work that we have underway now. That is work that we will resolve. That is work that I have as a challenge across my department in terms of our ability to track data and make sure that we have the ability to access it and produce it in a timely way.
With respect to the 2018 review, Chris, I don't know what the answer is in terms of whether we have now found it.
I cannot say that we have found it. We do know that it happened, and we know that we are taking the steps that emanated from that, and part of that is leading to better tracking, which paradoxically is sometimes leading to greater surpluses because we know better what is happening on the ground.
So, Mr. Chair, I will take an undertaking to actually resolve the question once and for all. Whether or not I can find it, if I may, we will go back, we will do a concerted effort and see if we can produce the report for the committee.
Thank you. We'll look for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tupper, for that. And I do look forward to that. And I do look forward to, at some point, getting some clear timelines on when these updates are going to happen within the department. I just concerning, having been on this committee for not a relatively short period of time, under the public safety portfolio, Public Safety Canada itself, but then also CBSA, seems to have a real problem with documentation and tracking of information. And I'm not asking a question at this point, but I'm just putting out there that there is a real concern about where this portfolio is going in terms of documentation and justifying where things have happened. I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to run out of time, but I want to turn to the RCMP. There was a standing committee report on Indigenous from Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada from 2021, June 2021. And the recommendation at the time was that the Government of Canada recommend that the RCMP conduct a thorough review of their hiring process and practices to recognize and address any systemic barriers that have had a negative impact on the hiring or selection of Indigenous officers. This review would also include recognizing and addressing any systemic barriers which have led to a greater number of Indigenous officers choosing to leave the force. So that was June of 2021. We're nearly 3 years later. What is the status on that recommendation? Has the RCMP undertaken that review, and what has come out of that?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, if I may. The RCMP's Management Advisory Board has also provided similar information that we received in the fall of 2023. We also have the RCMP Indigenous Collaboration, Co-Development, and Accountability Unit in 2021 to address some of those internal barriers to ensure that not only the Indigenous employees in the RCMP are provided fair and equitable opportunity, but external outreach as well. As I mentioned earlier, we've now hired a senior executive in the RCMP to oversee the First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit recruiting strategy. That strategy is up and running as recent as January this year. As mentioned, we've seen some positive results already. We've already seen an increased number of Indigenous applicants. We've hired our very first Inuit applicant in over 10 years. We're seeing cohorts. We've gone into Indigenous communities, and we've heard time and time again that Indigenous employees do much better when they're with other Indigenous cadets and employees. So we're seeing benefit from that. So I think we've come a long way.
Thank you very much. I turn now to Ms. Yep. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming. And this is a difficult topic. Mr. Tupper, could you please provide an update on engagement with Nunavut and Inuit communities regarding the program? Are there any conversations or negotiations happening to bring the program to these communities?
Right now, the major part of our authorities are to focus on First Nations communities. That is with specific regard to the development of the legislation, with a clear intent that we would follow up with Inuit communities to pursue a similar track with them. In terms of the program development, I will turn to Ms. Moran to elaborate further.
Thank you. So Nunavut has just acceded to the program for the first time since its inception, and we are in the midst of rolling out community tripartite agreements in collaboration with the territory as well as the communities there. I will just note that the program itself works slightly differently in the territories due to the fact that communities are often integrated, so it does require a slightly different conversation. And so the short answer to your question is yes, we are engaging now. We've been starting that conversation over the last few months. I would say it will intensify in the next 6 probably.
I understand in Nunavut there are, I believe, 22 community or 25 communities roughly. And is that what you meant by it's a little different?
I mean that there are, this program is designed to operate on reserve. And so in the territories where you have communities that are integrated or are not specifically a reserve, the program does operate differently. We have community tripartite agreements that serve cities where people are integrated, and we're ensuring that there is a culturally responsive complement of officers that are available for Inuit people who are living in the city, and we will ensure that that reporting is made public as we roll those out.
Thank you. Mr. Larkin, in your opening statement, you said the RCMP is committed to addressing systemic racism and discrimination while remaining dedicated to strengthening trust with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples, communities, and employees. How is this being addressed? It seems like it's a difficult balance there.
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. There's a number of activities that are ongoing across the organization as we've actually reconstructed and rebuilt our professional responsibility office, which oversees our values and ethics. Obviously continue to enhance our complaint system as well as our accountability system. That's included and tied to modernizing our training at Depot, which ensures more than 40 hours of culturally sensitive training specific to Indigenous communities. Assistant Commissioner Brown can provide more information, however, before a recruit leaves Depot, if they're being assigned to a First Nation community, there's a training guide as well as an understanding of where they're heading within our vast country and our very unique communities that we provide service to. But equally on the other side, we've been focused on accountability through enhancing our character-based leadership, our supervisory training, as well as our executive development program, so that leaders that come through the organization ensure that we actually change the course. Again, I want to recognize, we do recognize our historical role in the colonization, and the RCMP, as we look to the future, obviously needs to continue the work that we're doing to build trust, and so we want to recognize that. So there's a series of individual pieces. Reform and accountability is a new directorate which is taking the last decade of numerous recommendations around the RCMP, around enhancing and supporting and delivering better policing services to the citizens of Canada, as well as focused on culturally sensitive work, addressing internal systemic barriers. As Assistant Commissioner Brown indicated, we've been revamping our recruitment process. So there's a numerous number of different pieces that are ongoing. Warren, I don't know if you want to add anything to that response.
Mr. Chair, I think additionally we have an anti-racism unit now embedded within our Chief Human Resource Office. We are looking at a pilot project nationally right now for race-based data collection. So that's the perception of police officers when dealing with people that they encounter in community and whatnot. So we're hoping to learn from those experiences and just become better.
Is there any language training? Indigenous language training?
That's a very good question, Mr. Speaker. So yes, we're looking at implementing recognition for those employees who endeavor to learn Indigenous language in communities, albeit our tenure is often very short in some of the more remote locations. We're looking to see if we could find some sort of a retention and attraction strategy for that. Certainly, it's what our Indigenous communities want to see. We have some guidebooks with some plain language, some diagram, whatnot. So we're looking at programs to fill that gap. But certainly, that's a recommendation that we've also heard from the Commissioner's Indigenous Advisory Committee. So those are programs underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beginning our third round, Mr. Blake, I understand you're taking the official opposition spot. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my Conservative colleagues for the opportunity to use their time. A 2014 Public Safety Canada report acknowledged systemic violence when one service organization reported that, quote, an encounter with the police means arrest or rape. Do you understand the gravity of the violence your institution has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, certainly, yes, we understand the challenges and the history of our organization, and much of the work that we're doing is to actually look towards the future of enhancing that trust. And so, in short, yes, we do.
You know, we've heard these kinds of responses before. I'm a young member of Parliament. I've been here 3 years. I've heard that statement time and time again. And it becomes a question as to when that actually takes place. And I find that institutions only respond to force. That when it comes to why you won't do these things, it's, well, we'll look to the future. But who can't look to the future are those children, the little girls who go missing, the women who are murdered, and the people's families who are left behind. They can't wait for that, Mr. Larkin. The question becomes to the government, at what point do we just call it quits and say the RCMP is corrupt? We need to start over. We have to seriously ask that question. When it comes to institutions that fail us, we require a very serious and a very important review of the actual work the RCMP does. If your trust is so incredibly broken, Mr. Larkin, you've acknowledged that, at what point can a partner continue to beg for proper protection? When you can't even guarantee 3 days ago, one of your officers was charged with child exploitation. Who holds you accountable, Mr. Larkin?
Through you, Mr. Chair, first, there's a number of initiatives that are ongoing to actually address a series of recommendations that have...
Sorry, I have limited time. Who holds the RCMP accountable?
Well, the Commissioner does report to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you very much. That's an important piece to it. The Minister of Public Safety is aware of this. Deputy Minister, have you responded or have you met with the Minister of Public Safety in regard to these serious concerns?
So the minister would deal more directly with the RCMP as part of that operational organization that we
have you advised that the RCMP should be held accountable for this?
I have not.
Thank you for your honesty. It's important that we have honest representatives to this fact. Will you commit to bring this serious matter up to the minister? If it's the minister's job to hold the RCMP accountable, will you please inform him of this emergency? Children can't wait. We can't wait for this moment, for this future beautiful time. Countless victims are awaiting justice. Will you commit to inform the minister that we need a process of immediate accountability and a process to inform justice and a review of the RCMP's conduct from the top?
Mr. Chair, I commit to raising these issues with my minister.
Thank you very much. I do want to move now to an issue related to funding. Public safety holds funds because they're attached to older funding models from First Nations, and allowing provinces and territories to lead these funding models goes against the constitutional rights of First Nations. Consultation with First Nations is imperative. How do we intend to fix this issue, Deputy Minister?
So for the past 2 years, we have been out engaging with communities. Mr. Chair,
have you read the Constitution in terms of whose jurisdiction? You've commented on the jurisdiction several times. Have you read the section of the Constitution entitled Section 9124?
The sections that define federal responsibility towards Indian people and Indian lands?
Yep.
Yes.
Have you read that? And so why is it that a federal government who has whole and woolly jurisdictional power on First Nations reserves is using the excuse of a jurisdictional barrier by a province?
Well, because it's not an excuse, Mr. Chair. The reality is that the administration of justice is a provincial responsibility. We cannot go into provincial territory and implement laws or construct organizations that are outside the bounds of provincial and territorial law. That is also defined in the Constitution. So we work with the provinces, and that is why the 52...
Who suffers from this? Football passing, jurisdictional football passing.
I don't believe, Mr. Chair, that it's football passing.
The courts have ruled several times, actually.
They've used that
before.
We have a split in the funding that recognizes a 52% contribution from the federal government.
The AFN has said they've been stonewalled by your ministry. Will you meet with the AFN,
with the provinces
Mr.
and
Tupper?
territories?
Will you meet with the AFN on the funding?
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. We will be right back to you shortly. I'm going to call time out there. We are over our time. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I was just wondering, Mr. Larkin, we've dealt before with the shortage of RCMP officers and the difficulty in recruiting to remote areas. I was just wondering how much pay affects it. Can you perhaps elaborate what the pay rates for RCMP is with respect to provincial forces or municipal forces? Might that be a factor?
Mr. Chair, if I may. I can't get into specifics regarding pay. I do know that the RCMP, since we have been unionized, we're more comparable now with other similarly sized police forces across Canada. There are pay and benefits that I won't speak to from other police jurisdictions and provincial areas. So I believe now that our pay is more in line with other police departments in Canada. It has provided more opportunity for experienced police officers to join the RCMP, as well with our robust and aggressive hiring practices, we're seeing an increase in the number of people that we're having in the depot. So I anticipate that we're on a positive path forward to addressing some of our vacancies.
Okay, and can you elaborate on what the RCMP is doing specifically to increase public confidence and trust with our Indigenous communities?
Well, we have a number of programs underway. So again, primarily the Commissioner has his Indigenous Advisory Committee. So those are representatives from each province and territory to provide the Commissioner and myself, who's the chair of that committee, direction on what types of programs they would like to see in their communities. I think a gap that the audit had identified is that the RCMP were not a signatory to the CTAs. So I'm hoping that as we move forward in our management action plans that we can provide more input and feedback from the communities on the type of policing they'd like to see. We've identified that the CTA primarily under the FNIPP program is for enhanced policing. However, some of the communities, because we have built trust and confidence through those enhanced positions, they would like to see those police officers take on more of a core duty and responsibility. So I think by addressing some of those issues that we're in a better place. The commanding officers, so those who are in charge of each division as well, have their own advisory committees. So again, we have reporting elements in place for the detachments to meet frequently with Indigenous communities. So it's that consultation and feedback from the communities that provides us our direction.
Okay, and Mr. Tupper now, how does the public, first of all, I was wondering if you could explain like how you plan to bridge the gap between the two types of agreements. We keep referring to, the different service deliveries. You've got the two types of programs to ensure that there's equal and equitable access and service delivery across all communities. You've got the tripart agreements, and then you've got the self-governing ones. And also I'm interested to know in how you can encourage more communities to adopt the self-governing model.
Well, first of all, we need to be out there working with communities and hear from them in terms of whether or not they want to adopt that model. And that has to do with where they're located and the other resources that they have available to them. I think our goal over time, and particularly if we succeed at getting legislation in place, that it will start to define that path forward in terms of transitioning communities into more independent policing arrangements. But as I say, those will be choices that communities need to make, and that is part of the work that we're doing now, is to ascertain what that demand will be.
And also I understand that, the reason there's so many funds left over is because provinces or territories aren't stepping up and contributing their fair share. Could you elaborate as to which provinces and territories are not participating in the cost sharing?
So again, Mr. Chair, it's not so much that they're not stepping up. They make different choices through the funding cycles. All of the provinces and territories engage with us in this program. All of them invest in various ways in the program. They make choices about what priorities that they make, and that may be choosing between communities in terms of where they invest and where they don't invest. And it may simply be choices they make in terms of whether they augment the funding available in their programs overall. I want to be clear, provinces and territories are our partners in this program. We have a positive relationship with all of the provinces and territories in this work. It is an area of demand. Community safety is an area of demand where more investment could be made. I also want to kind of point out that it is not just policing that will be the issue in a lot of these communities. What we are doing through community safety planning, what we're doing in terms of crime prevention, what we do with respect to youth programming, gangs and drugs programming, those are all elements of how we invest in communities, and particularly Indigenous communities, to try and change, bend the data that we see in terms of crime rates. And all of those things work together and will all together define what our success is. It won't be just one investment through policing or any of those other programs I just mentioned.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant encore, c'est Monsieur Lemire.
Once again, it's Mr. Lemire for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Larkin, I'd like to know, have you had discussions with public safety on the way in which you can recognize and make Indigenous policing services essential. So could you share with the committee how that might look?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that. I would start off by saying, again, Mr. Tupper referred to earlier that the provinces and territories are responsible for the tempo, if you will, and the priorities for policing in that specific area. The RCMP, our primary concern is to ensure that all communities, public safety is the number one priority. And we would endeavor to support whatever program the provinces and territories under our contract would suit them best. So we would be nimble. It's not a one-size-fit-all, and no, as I said earlier, no two Indigenous communities are the same. So there's specific needs that some may have that others might have other priorities. So it becomes a little bit more of a complex, but certainly the RCMP are at the table to make sure that whatever service we provide, it meets the community's needs the best.
J'aimerais vous entendre davantage sur
I'd like to hear you speak more about the prioritizing of these Indigenous policing services. What have you done to develop capacity within these communities? Do you have regular exchanges with the Department of Public Safety? There seems to be a will on the side of Indigenous nations to see changes. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you. And the Auditor General has identified that gap. And, that's a gap through our management action plan that we hope we can sustain. I would, if I may, talk about our national reconciliation pathway that might assist. As we renew our priorities and commitments for reconciliation, we continue to embrace the phrase, nothing about us without us, ensuring the inclusion of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voices, perspectives, and advice in new and innovative ways of working together. This includes efforts to decolonize policing and enforcement through engagement and applying an Indigenous GBA plus lens, and review all policies, practices, and procedures to ensure service delivery is culturally appropriate. As well, the RCMP will use trauma-informed approach across all the organization's functions to increase safety for Indigenous women and girls. I would summarize your question by saying, when it is time to look at the renewal of CTAs, the RCMP would certainly like to be part of that conversation at the table.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just following up on my last round in relation to funding, Mr. Tupper, I don't believe your argument that this is a provincial jurisdictional issue will hold up in court. Jordan's principle is a good example of not too long ago, another deputy minister said the exact same thing. It's the provinces who are holding it. It's the provinces. But luckily enough, Indigenous people fought the government, and now Indigenous children have the opportunity to actually live in this country. Because the answer to my question of who suffers the jurisdictional football passing, it's Indigenous people. I'm confident that should your analysis and advice to the government be challenged by a court, that you'll lose that decision and Indigenous people will yet again win, just like we do most in cases at the Supreme Court when it comes to jurisdictional battles. And so I suggest that the Ministry of Justice should give you more advice, better advice, as to what the constitutional promises and the constitutional limits of Canada are and their relationship to Indigenous people. Because I fundamentally disagree that we should continue to suffer under a model that says jurisdiction has to take a front seat to lives of Indigenous people. I do now want to turn to the fact that Indigenous police services have to fight tooth and nail for the minimum funding. In early spring of 2023, funding negotiations between the federal government and the Indigenous Policing Services of Ontario fell through. March 29th, the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, who represent 9 standalone Indigenous services, filed a human rights complaint against Public Safety Canada, claiming underfunding and under-resourcing of Indigenous police services accounted to systemic racism. The funding agreements officially expired on March 31st, 2023. Are you aware of this, Mr. Tupper?
I am indeed, yes.
Why are there different funding models and terms and conditions when it comes to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous policing models?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Why are there different funding models and terms and conditions when it comes to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous policing models?
So I don't negotiate non-Indigenous policing models. So you are correct, and I am absolutely aware of the case that is before the courts now. We have tried genuinely to engage with the community. We have arrived at an impasse in terms of our understanding of the funding that we have available and how we can close an agreement with that community. We have reached an impasse. They have chosen to pursue a legal solution to that. I appreciate your earlier comments, sir, with respect to where the courts may go. And at this point in time, I think I can only comment that we will see how this gets itself resolved in the courts.
I want to note the court did rule against you already on this.
And it is under appeal.
Why are you appealing it?
Because we disagree with the original court position.
Who suffers?
I appreciate the communities. Mr. Chair, I do appreciate the difficulty of what
Mr. Tupper, who suffers?
The participants, the members of communities.
Thank you.
Mr. That is your time, I'm afraid. I'm going to go now to Mr. Melillo. You have the floor. I understand you're going to be splitting your time with Mr. Nader. Would you like me to split you halfway, or are you going to turn it over to him?
I'll turn it there.
That's fine. Just want to be clear, sure we're clear. Over to you. 5 minutes, please.
5 minutes, Chair? Thank you. Thank you again to the witnesses for being here and taking part in such an important discussion. I want to come back to the negotiations in terms of these important funding agreements. The Auditor General's report, Mr. Tupper mentioned that many communities did not feel engaged, that the negotiations were not true negotiations, and that the federal government was coming to the table already with predetermined funding allocations. So why is it that this is happening? It seems that your department is not negotiating necessarily in good faith.
Mr. Chair, I think there is a question of practice, which isn't a great answer in the sense of we have done it in the past that way, and we've continued to do it in the past or in the present that way. I think one of the efforts that we are trying to pursue in the department is that concentration of expertise and programming in one single place. I think our desire is indeed to be able to expand the kind of work that we do, to be able to engage more directly with and consistently with communities, to not rely on just the cycles of how these agreements work, but rather to kind of make sure that we have a much more consistent engagement with communities. So we learn in between funding decisions, we learn what the needs of communities are, and that gets reflected in the next round of discussions. That, I think, is something that will allow us to say that we are actually engaging in a better way with community leadership.
Understood. Now, have you taken any specific concrete measures in that regard that you can point to?
Well, we started with, as I say, bringing the entirety of my Indigenous activities within the department together. That has translated into some of our regional organizations so that I have people on the ground now. They will be more accessible to community leadership, and I think that that's a really important part of that is that people are present, that it's not kind of a fly-in, fly-out sort of relationship.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll move on to another topic with limited time, I'm sure, as you can appreciate. Mr. Tupper, I'll stick with you, though. The report also found that equitable funding is not defined by Public Safety Canada, and that, a quote here, that there was not an approach to allocate funds equitably to program recipients. We've heard that a bit already. So could you speak to why equitable funding does not have a specific definition and what the department's doing to rectify that?
On the latter part of the question, Mr. Chair, next month, as we engage with our partners in this, that has to be a part of it, is as we collectively look at the Auditor General's report and we understand the kinds of actions that we need to take to address the recommendations that have been made, that will be a part of the conversation. That equity is something that we have to share in terms of who the funders are and how we work with communities.
Okay, appreciate that. Just one more quick question before I turn the floor over to Mr. Nader. Again, Mr. Tupper, to you. Public Safety Canada, according to the Auditor General report, does not keep an accurate listing of the community agreements the tripartite agreements. Do you have any response to that?
May I turn to you, Chris?
You may, thank you. If you will permit me, Mr. Chair, I'd like to add a point about the equitable distribution, and part of the challenges with that is because the program does serve two very different types of policing, one being self-administered, one being community tripartite agreement. And the size of those self-administered services are quite different. We have some that are quite small and some that are very, very large by policing standards, which creates challenges. With respect to a single list, we use a database for program delivery, and it is true that there may not have been one single Excel spreadsheet, for example, with a listing, but it is not accurate that we do not know where that funding is going and who gets it.
Thank you for that. Unfortunately, I have to stop you there because I did promise Mr. Nader some of my time, so I'll turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Chair. In the very brief time, hopefully we can deal with this very quickly, but I'd like to move the motion that I have on notice from last week, that in relation to the committee's ongoing work on government contracting and further to the information provided by the Treasury Board Secretariat on April 12, 2024, the committee order, A, the production of copies of the 140 conflict of interest declarations filed in the 2022-23 fiscal year and the 162 conflict of interest declarations filed in the 2023-24 fiscal year concerning public servants employed in the core public administration who were involved in contractual relationships with the Government of Canada. B, the production of copies of any conflict of interest declarations filed in 2022, 2023, and 2023-2024 fiscal years by persons employed by the federal government, including crown corporations, but outside of the core public administration, who were involved in contractual relationships with the Government of Canada. And C, the production of records which detail all payments made in respect of the contractual relationships disclosed in the declarations referred to in paragraph A and B, provided that D, the names and contact information of the public servants may be redacted. E, for greater certainty, no redactions shall be applied to the names of contracting entities or the value of the contractual relationship disclosed, including, where multiple relationships are disclosed, the value of each contractual relationship disclosed. And F, these documents, with only the redactions authorized by paragraph D, shall be deposited with the clerk of the committee in both official languages. 1, in the case of the documents referred to in paragraphs A and B within 21 days of the adoption of this order, and 2, in the case of documents referred to in paragraph C within 35 days of the adoption of this order. Chair, I would just briefly comment, the article we saw in La Presse today just gives us further motivation for this information. It's been provided to us in a spreadsheet with